have to admit that we were so excited when we thought that the EPA administrator was going to be able to join us, and then also so disappointed when Rod Snyder called me a couple weeks ago and said something came up, it's not going to happen. And of course, with anybody who works in government, we understand how these things work. But then I said, well, do you think you could join us? And he said, well, if you'll have me. And I'm like, are you kidding? I mean, this guy is a wonderful asset to EPA in a position as a senior advisor to the administrator, a position he's held since 2021. And we are just sincerely very blessed to have Rod on board there. He has been someone who's been in this space of the environment for quite some time. From 2014 to 2021, he served as president of Field to Market, and I know many different groups are familiar with what Field to Market has been doing to try to be more measurable in terms of advances that commodity crop growers are making in the sustainability space. Prior to his time at Field to Market, he was holding a position as public policy director for the National Corn Growers Association. And as I said, he has just been someone who is super accessible, knowledgeable, and a great public servant. So please help me welcome Rod Snyder.
Well, good morning, Sarah. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I appreciate the Agribusiness Club of Kansas City and Agri-Pulse for having me. I do want to start by apologizing again for Administrator Regan. Of course, you all know that these are busy and somewhat uncertain times in Washington, D.C. right now, and the Administrator sends his regrets that he couldn't join us here in Kansas City. Again, my name is Rod Snyder. I serve as Senior Advisor for Agriculture to the Administrator. I've been in this role just about 2 years. It's my first time ever being inside of government at any level, so it's been a bit of an eye-opening and learning experience for me. I actually bring about 20 years of experience working across various organizations within the agriculture community, and I think one of the reasons why Administrator Regan asked me to join and take on this role is to bring a bit of a practical, real-world perspective as someone who hadn't necessarily been inside of government, who had actually been working out in the field with producers and with farm groups to try to bring that perspective into the agency. I do want to say another word or two just about Administrator Regan himself, because I do think he is a bit of a unique leader in terms of EPA administrators that I've seen across the course of my career. Many of you know that he served as Secretary of the Environment in North Carolina before coming to EPA, but more importantly, his background is directly connected to agriculture. His grandparents were farmers in rural eastern North Carolina, and his dad was an ag extension agent. He went to North Carolina Agricultural and Technical University. He didn't study ag himself, but he's been around agriculture his entire life. And when I think about when I started this job in 2021, thinking about how do you help an EPA administrator learn the basics of farming, we didn't have that learning curve with this administrator. That has served us, I think, as a sector incredibly well. He understands how critical these issues are and kind of approaches every day thinking about, how will agriculture in rural America respond to various initiatives. And since taking office, Administrator Regan has made it a priority to create regular engagement with ag and rural stakeholders and to show up in spaces where EPA leadership hasn't always gone. One key example was in April when he testified for more than 4 hours before the House Agriculture Committee. It had been the first time in 7 years that an EPA administrator had gone before either of the ag committees. In February, following President Biden's State of the Union address, Administrator Regan visited a farm in Bucyrus, Kansas, just 30 minutes south of where we are today, to host a climate-smart ag roundtable and to emphasize the administration's commitment to rural America. When you think about the State of the Union address, one of the things you may not know is that the day after, the president asks all the cabinet members to fan out across the United States and to help reinforce or deliver messages that had been in the speech the night before. So when I was talking to the administrator about where he might want to go out on the road the next day, he emphasized that he wanted to go into a rural place. It's easy to sort of gravitate towards the largest media markets to help, amplify a message, but we ended up in Bucyrus, on purpose, because there are so many ways in which this administration are working to try to strengthen ag and rural America, and he wanted to have those conversations during a week like that. And huge thanks also to Secretary Mike Beam from the Kansas Department of Agriculture for joining us on that trip. Our partnerships with the state ag commissioners over the last couple of years have been really critical. So during his visit to Kansas earlier this year, he saw a firsthand demonstration of an aerial drone sprayer, precision irrigation equipment, other advanced equipment technology that improves overall farm productivity while reducing environmental impact. And the innovations that the administrator observed that day weren't the result of any specific regulatory mechanism, but rather through farmers' underlying commitments to stewardship and continuous improvement in their own operations. So this morning, I want to spend the next few minutes providing updates on a range of issues that are of interest to the ag community and that are currently pending before the agency. So I'm going to try to tick through pesticide policy, waters of the U.S., PFAS, climate, and renewable energy. So bear with me, we've got a little bit of ground to cover here, and then I'm really looking forward to taking questions. So let me begin with pesticide regulations, which have historically been one of the most important areas of engagement between EPA and the ag sector. As you are aware, each and every pesticide product used by farmers across the United States is reviewed and approved by EPA. What you might not be as aware of is that multiple administrations have struggled over the years with balancing the scientific, legal, and policy considerations that arise from both FIFRA, Federal Pesticide Law, and the Endangered Species Act. On numerous occasions over the past 2 decades, federal courts have ruled that EPA has been out of compliance with the Endangered Species Act when registering pesticides, and the agency has faced an increasing number of lawsuits for failing to meet its obligation under the law. Given the way that we have always done this endangered species work in the past, it can take us anywhere from 4 to 12 years to complete ESA review and consultation for each pesticide. If you look at just what we've already agreed to in past litigation and the pesticides that are in litigation now, we won't finish all that work for those products well into the next decade, and that will only be about 5% of our entire ESA obligation across the whole program. It is an unsustainable current situation. So if we don't change the way we do this work, we run a very real risk of being sued and possibly forced to abruptly cancel registrations, leaving growers without the tools that they need to put food on the tables across America. So in response, we released an ESA, Endangered Species Act, work plan last year that outlines the steps we're taking to better protect endangered species while offering growers a range of options so they can decide which practices work best in their areas at particular times of year to reduce off-target impacts. Moving forward, EPA will consider a menu of FIFRA ecological mitigation measures and propose, based on the risks and benefits of the particular pesticide, which measures to include on the pesticide label. These measures are designed to focus protections only in specific needed areas, minimizing impacts to agriculture. We're coordinating this activity very closely with USDA, most specifically meeting regularly with the Office of Pest Management Policy, OPMP, and NRCS. In May, we jointly convened ag stakeholders at USDA's headquarters for discussions specifically about ESA mitigation measures to ensure we're getting meaningful feedback from across the sector. Most recently, we published a herbicide strategy that is a major step forward in our effort to develop a multi-chemical, multi-species approach to meeting our ESA obligations. The strategy includes practices that can be readily implemented by growers, including giving credit for those measures that are already being used to reduce herbicide drift or runoff. There's a public comment period on the herbicide strategy open until October 22nd, and we are especially eager for feedback on whether the menu of mitigation measures are practical and implementable for different kinds of production systems. Lastly, the agency is working closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop refined sub-county level maps to avoid mitigation areas where a species doesn't actually occur or exist. This will allow for more targeted mitigation measures and less impact on our food system. Administrator Regan and the entire leadership at EPA wants to get this right. We're eager to work with the ag stakeholder community to ensure we are meeting our obligations under the law while preserving the tools farmers need to grow our food. So let me now turn to offer a few comments on our recent Waters of the U.S. rulemaking. And I'm sure that, like many of you in the room, I've been working on WOTUS, of course, across the entirety of my career, I think now 20 years, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. It's important to state up front that Congress directed EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to define waters of the U.S. as a foundational element of the Clean Water Act. It's not a discretionary activity for our agencies. I'll sometimes have farmers come into EPA and say, why are you still working on WOTUS? The entire Clean Water Act has to rest on a foundation of how we define what is jurisdictional and what is not. That is something that Congress left to the agencies to define, and so we have no choice but to work on this. And over the last 2 decades, unfortunately, the only constant with WOTUS has been change. The definition of WOTUS has shifted from administration to administration and from court decision to court decision. This has resulted in confusion, inconsistency, and uncertainty for farmers and landowners. The prior 2 administrations' WOTUS rules had been vacated in federal court, which is why this January, EPA and Army announced a final rule that reinstates a definition of WOTUS that was largely founded in the pre-2015, kind of before the Obama and Trump rules in that framework. Of course, as everyone is now aware, on May 25th of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in the case of Sackett v. EPA. And for those of you who are watching closely at home, that is the 3rd U.S. Supreme Court decision related to WOTUS in the last 20 years. This has been an issue that we've been revisiting in the legal system quite frequently. So while the Supreme Court's decision in Sackett did not directly rule on EPA and Army's 2023 definition, the decision made certain aspects of the new rule invalid. So in light of this, on October 29th, EPA and Army issued a final rule to amend the 2023 definition to be consistent with the Supreme Court's most recent ruling. The agency's amendments are narrow and change only the parts of the 2023 definition that were invalidated by the Sackett decision. For example, the rule removes the significant nexus test from consideration when identifying tributaries and other waters as federally protected. It also revises the adjacency test when identifying federal jurisdictional wetlands, clarifies that interstate wetlands do not fall within the interstate waters category, and clarifies the types of features that can be considered under the additional waters category. The amendments do not affect any other aspects of the 2023 rule. Importantly, the amended final rule maintains several exclusions from the definition of WOTUS in the regulatory text, including things that the ag community had been asking for, things like certain ditches, artificial farm ponds, artificially irrigated areas, and prior converted cropland that are immediately and through the regulatory text excluded from jurisdiction. The rule supports longstanding activity-based permitting exemptions provided to the agricultural community by the Clean Water Act. And this is consistent with Administrator Regan's goal of delivering clarity to stakeholders, including farmers, ranchers, and landowners. With this final rule, the Army Corps of Engineers has also resumed issuing all jurisdictional determinations that have been paused in light of the Sackett decision. The agencies have recently hosted 3 public webinars this month to provide updates on the definition of WOTUS and are planning to hold listening sessions this fall with co-regulators and stakeholders. The goal of the listening sessions will be to better understand any implementation-related questions remaining after the final rule, and the ag community will be an important part of this outreach. Let me now turn to an emerging issue of concern that I have to admit, all of the different topics that I'm talking about this morning, when I took this job 2 years ago, I knew I would be working on them. They were pretty predictable, but on the issue of PFAS, this was something that I had to quickly get up to speed on, and I think the broader ag sector is just beginning to understand the implications. There's an increasing body of science demonstrating that PFAS chemicals pose significant public health and environmental risks for communities across the country. These forever chemicals have been used for decades in a wide range of products and industries and are particularly troublesome because they persist in the environment. I do want to be very clear from the start of this little section that the food supply in the United States is among the safest in the world. FDA is doing regular testing now and has shown no detections of PFAS in about 97% of the fresh and processed foods out of more than 700 samples in their ongoing total diet study. I actually had a panel at NASDA's annual meeting with the state ag commissioners last week with FDA and USDA, and really tried to emphasize the fact that from a broader food supply perspective, there is not reason for panic among the public, and that there is ongoing testing going on that's demonstrating largely no presence of the chemicals. But at the same time, we understand that PFAS contamination presents unique and complex challenges in local areas where perhaps the chemicals have been exposed in the environment, and to farmers and ranchers that might be impacted in those local areas. That's why EPA is working to bring all of its resources and authorities to bear to provide science-based solutions to protect public health, including our food and ag system. In October of 2021, the agency released our PFAS strategic roadmap, which laid out plans to strengthen federal leadership and advance key actions to safeguard public health and protect the environment and hold polluters accountable that have manufactured and released significant amounts of PFAS into the environment. Recent actions include proposing to designate PFOA and PFAS, two of the most common PFAS chemicals, as CERCLA hazardous substances, while also meeting with representatives from farm groups to discuss the development of an enforcement discretion policy under CERCLA. The agency has also proposed a national drinking water standard for 6 PFAS substances for the first time ever, and we've begun distributing $10 billion in bipartisan infrastructure law funding to address these emerging contaminants in water systems, much of which will provide critical investments for small, disadvantaged, and rural communities that may not have a ratepayer base to make the necessary upgrades. We also have announced our commitment to finalize a risk assessment for PFOA and PFAS and biosolids by the end of 2024. The risk assessment is a comprehensive effort to determine the risk to human health and the environment based on exposure of these chemicals and biosolids, including the potential impact on crops and grazing land through land application. We have determined, at least through some early studies and incidents in working with the states, that this is one of the primary routes of exposure of PFAS that's making its way onto farms. The risk assessment will help EPA determine what standards for biosolids or other actions may be necessary to mitigate those risks. And in late July, we partnered with NASDA and the Environmental Council of the States to publish joint principles for preventing and managing PFAS and biosolids, an important risk comms tool that can be used for communicating disposal practices to the public in advance of the completion of our risk assessment next year. In addition, Congress provided EPA with $8 million in appropriations this year to prioritize new federal research that will help farmers, ranchers, and rural communities manage PFAS in agricultural settings. The agency is currently working with USDA to invest in agronomic research to better understand PFAS uptake in plants and animals, to reduce exposure in our food supply and promote farm viability. I do want to emphasize that EPA is redoubling our efforts to collaborate with our federal and state partners to ensure continued safety of the food supply while protecting farmers, ranchers, and their families from potential risks. I'm personally participating in an interagency process with USDA, FDA, and the White House Council on Environmental Quality to identify gaps as well as opportunities for a more coordinated federal response. So let me turn in this final section to a discussion of climate and energy policy. It is no secret that America's farmers and ranchers find themselves on the front lines of climate impacts. Severe storms, widespread flooding, changes in insect and pest pressure, prolonged drought, and more frequent wildfires are creating unprecedented risks and challenges for our food system. Even more concerning is that these extreme weather events threaten to erode agricultural productivity during a time when global population is surging and we have more mouths to feed. A really interesting meeting last week with USAID and their new Bureau for Resiliency, Environment, and Food Security, thinking about the added pressure on the global food system due to climate impacts. And Hans earlier from Cargill talked about the fact that feeding 10 billion people by 2050 is one of the greatest challenges of this century. It's exacerbated by these weather patterns that are really putting pressure on producers in the United States and around the world. So in recognition of these tremendous challenges, last year Administrator Regan rechartered EPA's Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Federal Advisory Committee and asked the committee to spend the next 24 months evaluating how EPA's tools and programs can best advance the U.S. agriculture sector's climate mitigation and adaptation goals. By identifying voluntary incentive-based opportunities, public-private partnerships, and market-based approaches, EPA can support farmers and ranchers in their efforts to reduce emissions, sequester carbon, and accelerate a more resilient food and ag system. The good news is that there is cause for optimism. Now more than ever, it's clear that both the public and private sectors recognize that agriculture has a unique role to play in contributing to nature-based solutions to address climate change. Last summer, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It's the single most significant piece of climate legislation in our nation's history. The historic investments from the IRA will help reduce emissions and encourage the development and deployment of new low-carbon technologies. The law includes a historic $20 billion investment in climate-smart ag programs through USDA, which will help farmers reduce emissions, sequester carbon, and improve the resiliency of their operations. And I know that Hans mentioned earlier how critical measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification is for the entire supply chain. USDA also mentioned, recently announced $300 million to advance MMRV technologies and research to ensure that we are actually properly crediting farmers and ranchers for the work that they're doing to help advance these goals. In addition, the Inflation Reduction Act provided EPA with more than $41 billion to implement multiple new programs to help address climate-related challenges. For example, our newly launched $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is intended specifically to mobilize financing and private capital towards climate solutions. Another key program is EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grants, providing approximately $5 billion to state and local governments to develop and implement GHG reduction strategies. More than 45 states have opted into the program and are currently developing climate action plans. In fact, just last month, EPA hosted a webinar for these CPRG recipients to specifically consider how to integrate incentives and support for agriculture and working lands into their climate action plans. So you think about all of the funding that's coming through USDA, there are additional opportunities through EPA working in partnership with states to help incentivize this work. And it's just one more indication of how our agency is viewing the ag sector as a key partner in this work, not through regulatory mechanisms, but through these types of voluntary incentive-based approaches. It's also important to note that agriculture is contributing significantly to low-carbon energy solutions. For example, EPA is co-hosting this November an anaerobic digestion on the farm conference at Iowa State University, where we will explore ways to scale up methane capture and renewable energy production from livestock operations. I should mention the Region 7, the Midwest Ag Advisor that is based here in Kansas City is Doug Jones, sitting right over here. They're the ones hosting that event in Ames, so it's local to this area. If you all are interested in participating, please talk to us during the day today, and we'll get you more information. The administration is also committed to addressing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, and we're open to using every tool available in this effort, including biofuels. Notably, the Inflation Reduction Act includes biofuels tax credits, funding for blender pump infrastructure, and incentives for sustainable aviation fuel development. And I know many of us in the room are paying attention to the guidance that the Treasury Department is developing right now around the types of feedstocks that will qualify for SAF tax credits. Of course, this is in addition to EPA's important role of administering the Renewable Fuel Standard. Upon arriving at EPA 2 years ago, Administrator Regan made it clear that getting the RFS back on track has been one of his key priorities, and I think we've been delivering on that. The RFS program has played a central role over the past decade in driving the development and use of low-carbon biofuels, but at the time was suffering from COVID-related impacts and several years of mismanagement. So in June, EPA finalized the largest renewable volume obligations in the history of the RFS, which means greater opportunities for farmers to deliver low-carbon biofuels into the future. I want to repeat that. We have finalized the largest renewable volume obligations in the history of the program. With the demand created by the RFS set rule, we project that the new standard will require nearly 7 billion RINs worth of advanced biofuels, including biomass-based diesel in 2025. That's a nearly 40% increase over the 2022 baseline. And for corn-based ethanol, the final rule sets targets at or above the 15 billion gallon statutory level for all 3 years. That had not been done prior to this administration. The most recent RFS rule was also unprecedented due to the fact that it included volumes for a 3-year period rather than a single year. So for 2023, 2024, and 2025. And this was based upon input from stakeholders who have told us that longer-term targets are needed to help the agriculture, biofuels, transportation, and energy sectors plan for the future. The RFS program continues to play an important role in diversifying our nation's energy supply, improving energy independence and security, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and supporting rural economies. According to our analysis, we estimate that the RFS program increases revenues for farmers by approximately $18 billion every single year. So before closing, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my own personal connections to the sector. Yes, I have worked in agriculture at various trade associations and nonprofits over the years, but I also come from a farming family in Jefferson County, West Virginia, in the northern Shenandoah Valley. My family first settled in the area in the late 1700s, one of numerous family farms at the time dotting the landscape. In 1896, this is on my father's side of the family, we planted our first red delicious apple trees, which grew into a several hundred-acre orchard over the course of the 20th century. Sadly, like many other families, we lost our operation during the height of the Great Depression. Although today I live now on another small farm just a mile from the property and remain friends with the current owners. Last month, we buried my great uncle in the family cemetery that's nestled amongst the apple orchard. He was the last member of my family to be born in the farmhouse on the property 98 years ago. And then in less than a year, next August, I'll be getting married in a ceremony in the barn that my ancestors built in 1812 in the heart of the orchard. I say all of this to emphasize an important point. Farming is more than just a job. It's a heritage, a legacy, and a lifestyle. And I think it's important for everyone here today to understand that there are members of this administration who understand this and who want to be full partners with America's ag producers to ensure the continued success and vitality of this industry. So on behalf of Administrator Regan and all of us in the Biden administration, we will continue to seek out win-win solutions that provide climate benefits, rural economic development opportunities, and sources of domestic food, fiber, and renewable energy during uncertain global times. And I am truly thankful for the opportunity and the invitation to be here in place of my boss, who is very sad that he couldn't join me. I promise he would rather be here than what he's doing today. And I look forward to answering questions. Again, thank you so much, Sarah.
Well, aren't we fortunate to have Rod here with us, and he has agreed to take a few of your questions, so please get out your Slido app, and I see a few of them are starting to populate now. I'm going to start with one for you on the fact that we understand at USDA, at least, in terms of the staff necessary to get some of these climate-smart practices on the ground with technical expertise, there's really a shortfall, especially at NRCS, with technical expertise to help farmers adapt to new practices. What's that situation look like for workforce at EPA in terms of all the regulatory things that you're looking for? Are you also being challenged by labor shortages?
It's a great question. So these are historic investments across multiple federal agencies, and I would say EPA right now is hiring up in a way that's been unprecedented, at least in recent decades. We're trying to bring on a federal staffing at both the headquarters and regional offices to administer these programs. Now, I should also say that some significant portion of funding is also going through as grants to states that are then administering them through. So it's a shared partnership. It's not just that it's all going to be spent and administered through the federal level, but yes, we are hiring up just the same as USDA. And I would say USDA, I don't want to speak for them, but they're also looking at more creative opportunities to partner with the private sector on things like technical service providers and other things that were identified through the Growing Climate Solutions Act as well. So it's going to be a combination of both, I think, public and private sector investments and partnerships with farmers on the ground to make this happen.
Thanks. I know it's been a struggle, not only because of COVID getting people back to work, but just the retirements that we're seeing across the federal government. Yeah. So you mentioned ethanol, and the work that you have done has been historic in a lot of ways. One of our questioners wants to know if you could comment about the EPA Scientific Advisory Panel and some of the questions that came up on the value of ethanol. And I think longer term, how do we get to some sort of a consistency across the federal government that, how we value and measure ethanol's contributions?
I'm so glad that question was answered because it's very timely. Just last week, Thursday and Friday, EPA's Independent Science Advisory Board, the SAB, met in Washington, D.C., and one of the topics that they took up in terms of a draft commentary was looking at how do we value the greenhouse gas benefits of biofuels, but specifically from corn-based ethanol. I want to start by mentioning that this is an independent science advisory board. So they take up what issues they want to, they take positions that they want to, and then they deliberate those and then report them to the administrator. So this was not something that was initiated at either the career or political staff level. It was done by the SAP themselves. Where I think we sort of appreciate their conversation is that everyone agrees that we need to do a better job of valuing the greenhouse gas benefits of various feedstocks. EPA's renewable fuel standard rulemaking in 2010 was the last time we established those greenhouse gas values for different feedstocks. The world has changed a lot in the last 13 years. Technologies have improved, farmers have become more efficient, biofuels facilities are taking on different processing, which has also made it less greenhouse gas intensive. So we are interested in also improving the science around this within the agency. As part of the RFS set rule that was published in June that I mentioned, there was what is called a model comparison exercise that was published at that time that looked at a wide variety of models and studies that looked at greenhouse gas emissions values of different feedstocks. And there's a huge range. So within the technical staff of our agency, we want to narrow that range. We want to have a better understanding and some consensus. That's going to take some time. I think we're appreciative of the SAB for raising the issue, and that's probably the most I should say about that.
I know you do have some restrictions on some of the things that you can comment about. And just along that vein, you mentioned methane digesters. As I mentioned earlier, we've started covering more of the issues more closely in California, and there seems to be an effort underway by the California Air Resources Board to rethink what they've been doing to incentivize dairies to go into methane digesters. A lot of folks think it's been a tremendous success story, and they're worried that some of the concerns over having dairies in the state might lead to others trying to shut them down and removing this sort of an opportunity to capture methane. Do you see any sort of trends around the country where you've got some states that are perhaps being less favorable to methane digesters and that there might not be that strong future for them 10, 20 years from now?
So, yeah, I don't want to speak for California. I certainly don't want to speak for them, but I would say that at a federal level, we've had a lot of recent conversations, including with USDA, and within EPA's Farm and Ranch and Rural Communities Federal Advisory Committee. We actually have a meeting of that committee, which is made up of volunteers from across the sector, including some beef operations, et cetera, dairy and others. They're meeting this Thursday, and it's a public meeting, and one of the things that they're going to be talking about is how can EPA's policies better support on-farm renewable energy, including methane capture. So there's a real interest within the agency and within our Federal Advisory Committee to figure out better ways to support and advance this technology. It's the entire reason we're having this conference at Iowa State University in November, is thinking about how can we bring more federal leadership to scale up this technology. We also know that this is expensive. Methane digesters are expensive, and so when you think about the scalability, how do we downscale the opportunity for smaller and medium-sized farmers to be able to take advantage of this technology? I actually went out to California in March and visited a small dairy that was operating, I think, fewer than 300 or 400 dairy cows that had a methane digester, but that's a little bit unique. Typically, it takes a much larger operation to be able to do that. So it's one of the questions and conversations that we've been having with USDA and with partners across the sector is how can this technology be more accessible to more producers into the future? Again, I can't speak to any specific state approach, but we are certainly interested in this and want to hear from the industry.
Okay. One of the other questions that came in had to do with not only the fact that USDA and EPA have talked about how agriculture, including forestry, can contribute to being a net carbon sink, but concerned about whether or not that message is really getting through, especially on the national level. Any thoughts on how more people can share the sort of the good news about the opportunities for ag and forestry versus being considered part of the problem? This person would like to know how to be more part of the solution.
I think that's a great way to frame it. And first of all, the history of this issue has been so interesting. I've been working on the ag and climate issue for most of my career. And when I think back to around 2009, almost 15 years ago now, I was working with the National Corn Growers, and we took a small delegation of farmers to Copenhagen to COP15, which there was it was Obama's first year as president. There was a lot of sort of interest around, was there going to be this global climate deal that year in Copenhagen? Well, it fell flat. It was kind of a failure. But what was interesting about the trip was that it was the first time that we had taken conventional row crop farmers to a UN climate summit to talk about what is the role of American agriculture in this conversation. Fast forward 15 years, now most of the major national farm groups, American Farm Bureau and all the commodity groups, are actively working on climate policy and are looking at ways in which farmers can be a part of the solution and also can benefit economically for the ecosystem services that they are delivering through their operations. And so, first of all, I'm encouraged by the fact that the conversation has shifted in a really positive way. Second of all, there are very few industries out there that have the opportunity to actually not just reduce emissions, but as you pointed out, be a carbon sink, whether that's through trees, of course, but also in the soil. Plants are taking carbon out of the soil, out of the atmosphere every single day. I think there's an increasing recognition of the role that the ag and forestry sector can play alongside other segments of the economy that's unique. I will say EPA understands that, USDA certainly understands that, but I'm glad that all of the sort of national ag groups and state commodity groups are also developing programs to lean into that, because now it's a tremendous opportunity, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from an economic perspective for farmers to take advantage of.
So you mentioned the endangered species strategy and the pesticide pilot that's been proposed by EPA. And one of our questioners wants to know just how do you see that playing out? I know there's still open for comment. Hopefully you're hearing from a lot of agricultural groups. I know you've heard a little bit from USDA already on their perspective on how it might or might not work. Can you walk us through the process of just what is going to go into this final decision? And I know you can't comment on how it's going to play out exactly, but...
No, it's a totally fair question, and part of the reason why I think this is so difficult is that we're in a bit of uncharted territory. For many years, the agency was doing ecological risk assessments, but not specifically tackling the Endangered Species Act. It was for many decades, I think we'll admit at this point, it just wasn't being done. Then, for the last 15 or so years, we've been basically doing it on a chemical by chemical basis. If we got sued, we would go work on that particular active ingredient and try to develop something for the label that was, customized for that particular product. We will never get through the workload that way. So, yes, last year, thinking about sort of a multi-chemical, multi-species approach through our ESA work plan, it was the first time that the agency ever tried to do it. Do we have a choice? No. If we continue to lose in federal court, there's a real risk to the food system that certain products could be either canceled or severely restricted or limited by judges, by courts. And in many respects, we lose control of our own destiny. As a regulatory agency, as a science-based agency, we are essentially abdicating that responsibility to the courts if we don't do something in a different way. So I want to be clear, it's not just for sport or for good fun. We have reached a point where we have to do something differently. With that being said, the proposals that have come forward over the last several months, including the herbicide strategy, the vulnerable species pilot, we have heard loud and clear from a number of farm groups that there are aspects of those proposals that are really difficult to implement. Either they're not fit for purpose for certain production systems, or perhaps the right types of practices are not allowable under the program, or perhaps the species range information of where the threatened or listed species is located is not well refined. In other words, we have to work with Fish and Wildlife Service to determine what are the maps for where these species actually occur, and that they need to be tightened. All of those are fair comments. And it's one of the reasons we extended the comment period on the herbicide strategy, was to try to get more of this feedback in. When these comment periods are closed, the team is committed, and I think we had meetings last week, a couple different meetings with grower organizations to talk about ways in which we're evaluating those comments. We're going to look to try to integrate some of that feedback. We want to have as minimal of an impact on the average farmer as possible. We don't want to create widespread impacts to farmers across the country, but we do have an obligation to meet the Endangered Species Act requirements, and also try to help farmers meet their obligations as well. That's what we're trying to drive towards. We have a little ways to go, but our doors are open, and I'm having meetings every single week on this topic, and it's critically important that we get it right.
Well, I'm just always amazed at the breadth of regulatory issues that you need to keep in mind. So we're just about close to our break. I'm going to just ask you a last one real quickly. PFAS is something that a lot of folks hadn't even had in their vocabulary or an acronym in their mind for a long time, and now it's all over the place. Can you just tell us, how are the funds available being deployed? Is it mitigation? Is it water? Is it soil?
It's a great question. So there are multiple ways, I think, that right now the various federal agencies are working on this. Certainly FDA is increasing testing just to make sure we understand what's out there in the environment and the food system. That's largely been a good news story. It's not showing up in most food products, hardly any. USDA, the only sort of formal program they have right now is through the Dairy Indemnity Payment Program, the DIP program, which because of some early unfortunate incidents, including a very high-profile one in New Mexico, USDA worked with Congress and others to develop a system of payments that could help make dairy producers whole if there's another incident like the one we saw in New Mexico. EPA, in many respects, the role we're playing is trying to cut off PFAS at its source. We are putting the drinking water standards into place to try to make sure that it's not making its way into drinking water systems. We're setting other standards under our Superfund law. We're trying to get at those manufacturing and releases at that level so that we don't have downstream effects. That's our goal. So in total, we're working collectively across the federal, and also in advancing research. We need to better understand how is it making its way into sort of grazing land or cropland, and what's the plant uptake? And are there remediation opportunities in soils? We've also hearing from some leading states like Maine and Michigan and New Mexico on research they have underway. So we're at the tip of the iceberg right now in terms of our understanding, but there is, I think, just an increased interest amongst the federal government in trying to solve this so it doesn't become a more widespread problem. And for farmers that do have a challenge, we want to make sure that we're full partners in helping them remediate.